If you've been following my channel over the past few months, you probably know I have been a huge critic of the PlayStation Classic, which is why it probably comes as a huge surprise to know that at the end of December, after they got price cut down to $60, after I made the video debating if it was even worth it at $60, I came to end up buying one. Now basically, I got a Nintendo Classic for Christmas. It was worth $60. I ended up taking it back and getting this because I felt like for $60, this was a better value. For one, because it came with 2 controllers, and for 2, because I do have other consoles that I can play NES games on, just like I have other consoles that I can play the PlayStation games on, which is one of my biggest complaints about this, was I felt like this was something that everybody already owned. And when it came out, when it was announced, people told me, it doesn't really matter if I don't like the game list. I'd speculated that the game list beyond the first 5 games would be very poor, and that's why they held back announcing it. With the exception of Metal Gear Solid, I believe that to be true. The remaining 15 games were very poor. Now, my reason that I wasn't interested in modding it was I didn't think it'd be possible to do so this soon. At the time, I did not realize that these are actual USB ports on the front of the console. It's not a proprietary controller port like I anticipated, like Nintendo had used. And for whatever reason that Sony decided to do that, maybe it was less expensive, they opened themselves up very quickly to software modding, which is why I have this SanDisk flash drive right here that I got at Target for $8, the 32 gig, that I have loads of games on. I think about 35. It's nowhere near full, but I have about 35 games for the PlayStation 1 on here, as well as some retro games, because this can also run games from other consoles through RetroArch. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about all the different things that my PlayStation Classic can do, what I've thought was best for myself when using it, and why I've actually grown to surprisingly enjoy using this little device, even though it shares much of the functionality that something like my modded PS3 or my modded PS TV could do. So I'm going to hop right onto the system and show you guys what I'm working with my BleemSync 1.0 setup. So as mentioned, I'm using the 1.0 version of BleemSync, which comes with RetroArch pre-installed. Now there's also a 0.4 version of this software that some people do prefer. While both of them do run off of the USB drive, the 0.4 version makes no real edits to the system itself, whereas this 1.0 version does install some permanent files onto the hardware, though it's very difficult to find those files unless you are really looking through the system. So here I'm just actually scrolling through all the different games I have on my PlayStation Classic. You can tell in total there's about 55 games, I think 35 of them that I added, as well as 20 that came pre-installed. Now with the 1.0 version like I'm using, it will show those 20 games in the carousel even with the USB plugged in with your games added, whereas in the 0.4 version, the pre-installed games were only accessible with the USB removed. So I have, games that maybe aren't the most popular overall, but they're games, like Pajama Sam, that are very iconic to me. I didn't own a PlayStation 1 back in the 90s. I played primarily on a PC. A lot of these childhood games, like one of my personal favorites, the Buzz Lightyear game that Disney came out with in the 90s. But many of them were also released on the PlayStation 1. Then, of course, there's the exclusives in there, like the Spyro series and the Crash Bandicoot series, that I didn't get to play until their later iterations on the PlayStation 2. I think that's the interesting thing about the original PlayStation. It comes from an era where it had so many different great genres of games on. If you loved fighting games, there were obviously fighting games that you loved on the PlayStation 1. If you loved RPGs, there were a ton of great RPGs. If you loved racing games, there were a ton of great racing games. It seems like every genre was well represented by multiple great titles. So right here, I've just booted into the Toy Story racing game. You can tell I got into the main menu very quickly, and that was due to the fact that I actually had a save state. Another big benefit I consider the 1.0 version of BleemSync to have is the fact that I'm able to run the game through the BleemSync UI, through that classic carousel the console came with, but it's actually playing it through RetroArch, and still by pressing the reset button on the physical console itself, I can create a save state to go back to, which I find to be very convenient. Now, alternatively, there is a button combination that you can use, and I'll show you that here, to open up the RetroArch menu, where of course then you can take screenshots, you can create save states through there. I just find that using that physical reset button on the console is just, it feels better to me. Plus, I think that I do like the UI on BleemSync much better than I like the RetroArch UI with this just really busy feeling XMB that's just got a lot of stuff in the menus. I know there's plenty of people that absolutely love RetroArch, but it's just not something for me. At least I don't like the user interface side of it. Now, if I do quit and close the content, it will unfortunately boot me back to the RetroArch UI, which is a bit of a downfall to using the button combination and restarting the game from here, because now ultimately I'm in the RetroArch UI, whereas I want to be in the BleemSync UI. So now I'm actually going to do a fresh boot, and we're going to go straight into RetroArch and show you how you can play some of the classic games through the RetroArch cores, through its emulation system, to play games from not just the PlayStation 1, but things like the NES, the SNES, the Game Boy, even the Nintendo 64. Now right now, I only have some SNES games loaded on here, and I did that because I just have the basic PlayStation Classic original controllers without the thumbsticks. So because of that, I'm kind of limited to games that use a D-pad and use a 4-button system, which is the NES, the SNES, the Game Boy, things of that nature. Now, because the PlayStation Classic uses a USB plug-in, it does have support for really any USB controller through the drivers in RetroArch, which is really fascinating because, for one, you could plug any controller in, any DualShock controller, be it the DualShock 2, 3, or 4. Now, in order to use the PlayStation 2's DualShock 2, you'd have to have a physical adapter, but with the other ones, it'd be USB based. You'd be able to plug those in and use them to play the PlayStation 1 games. Really easy to use thumbsticks all of a sudden. But what interests me about the Nintendo 64 emulation, and what I haven't got out of Nintendo 64 emulation in past, using it on my Xbox and so forth, is I could buy a Nintendo 64 USB controller on eBay for like, say, $8, and I could plug that straight into the PlayStation Classic, and all of a sudden I could be playing Nintendo 64 emulated games using a Nintendo 64 style controller, which would feel much better than my past experiences using Xbox controllers and whatnot. So today I just wanted to show you guys what is possible with the PlayStation Classic, because I think this console turned out to be so much more than meets the eye, and it's thanks to all the great work that's been done with BleemSync. So if you're interested in installing BleemSync, whether it's the 0.4 version, which makes no edits to the hardware itself, or the 1.0 version, which does have some improvements in the overall performance, I would recommend you check out one of the tutorials I have linked in the description. This is the one that I use to get my system all set up. You will need a flash drive. I highly recommend you get a SanDisk flash drive, preferably a Cruiser like the one you see on the screen right now. Those have had the best compatibility, as I've also tried PNY drives, Lexar drives, and none of them have worked. You will also want to get probably a USB hub if you plan on having multiple players, as the USB thumb drive will take up a spot on the controller port. And then if you really have no idea how, like if you're just not tech savvy and you have no idea how to do this, I would recommend the Arcade Man builds. These are using the 0.4 version of BleemSync, and basically you download his files, be it if you want to use a 32 or a 64 gigabyte flash drive. You just simply download his files and you drag them onto your flash drive, plug the flash drive into the console, and all of a sudden you have a pre-made list of 50 plus games that he's put together into one convenient pre-made setup that really all you have to do is just copy onto your flash drive. So those Arcade Man builds have been very popular among people who maybe aren't necessarily so tech savvy and don't want to go through what I think is actually a fairly simple process of setting this up. And again, those are going to be on the older 0.4 version, because the 1.0 version does not allow you to simply copy over files without using its UI, which has been kind of frustrating to some people and made things be messy. I do think you would get an enjoyable experience though out of using that 0.4 version and the Arcade Man builds. So I'll also have some of those linked down in the description. You can check those out. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Bailey, and I will see you in the next video.